about these mercy, pity, sympathy, and compassion words this morning, so we're going to be looking at sympathy and compassion then. You know, I was going over some old scrap paper, scrap notes I had last night, the other evening I guess that was, yesterday evening, and I had a lot of early material for Christian ethics. I was a little amused. I had 24 messages that I was certain that we'd teach 24 messages in Christian ethics. And we've already passed 124 now. We're just beginning to go. It's interesting how the longer you're in this, the more you have to say. Though I don't guess I would have had a lot to say back then, 24. I thought I was doing good with 24 messages. That sounds like a long tape series, 24 tapes. But I had a little series entitled Responsibilities to Yourself, and I had one message underneath that. And Responsibilities to Others, and I had two messages underneath that. So I don't know if I'm supposed to say I'm sorry that I didn't stay with my original 24. I'm really not sorry. I'm glad we have a lot more to say. Sympatheo. 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 Well, what word do you think we get from that word? Sympathy, obviously. We get sympathy from that word. Sympatheo, a verb that appears 2 times, only in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 4:15 and Hebrews 10:34. One of those referring to Christian sympathy and one to Christ's sympathy. We don't have very many sympathy words. We only have 2 we're going to look at, 2 Greek words. And totaling them up, they appear only 3 times. So it's not that significant of a word. And we won't have any problems with the NIV on any of these sympathy words. I think we will with the King James Version, but you can already tell just from looking at the word, sympatheo, that obviously the derivative would not be compassion or pity or mercy. It'd have to be sympathy. Hebrews 4:15. For we have not an high priest which cannot sympathize, cannot be touched. That's saying the same thing, but it's the word sympathize. It's a verb. We have not an high priest which cannot sympathize with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And then in Hebrews 10:34, the author of Hebrews said, For ye had sympathy of me in my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and an enduring substance. Okay, before moving on to the other word, let's see what we have in common between these 2 verses. For ye had sympathy of me in my bonds. So the author of Hebrews is going through some type of suffering, persecution. He's imprisoned here. And he said, writing to the Hebrew Christians, you sympathize with me. You had sympathy with me in my bonds. Same ideas over here in Hebrews 4:15. We have not an high priest which cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, with our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are. So those verses help us better understand the meaning of the word. The word is really a compound word that means something like this. Although, of course, we had reversed it in English. Sympatheo means to suffer with. It's a compound word, 2 words that mean to suffer with. essentially what the meaning of the term is. So it means to suffer, but not bodily, but in mind, affection, feelings, emotions. Hence our word sympathy. Now see if this isn't what we have here, for instance, in chapter 4. Let me cut out all the negatives. It's a difficult sentence because it says, we don't have a priest which cannot do this. So in other words, we have one who can. When you have double negatives like that, it always makes a sentence difficult to understand. So let me read it the way we would understand it, the way we would write it in English. We have a high priest who can sympathize with the feeling of our weaknesses. That's the same as saying we have not a high priest who cannot sympathize, just striking out the double negative. We have a high priest who can suffer with the feelings, and notice, or the feeling singular, notice we even have that term there, the feeling of our infirmities, which means our spiritual weaknesses, not bodily diseases here, which is what we mean by infirmities. An infirm person is a sick individual. But that was not true with Old English. That's just true with the way we use the term in English today, infirmity or infirmity. It would better be translated weakness, something like that. We have a high priest who can suffer with the feelings we go through. Why? We're told here, because he was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. But how does Christ, our high priest, now suffer with us? Well, nothing can touch him as far as, something bodily or spiritually or something. But in his feelings, his emotions, his mind, his thoughts toward us, he can and he does suffer along with us. That's what the word means, sympathy means. Suffer along with us. Now, it's kind of, however, like pity, the way that it's used today. Don't you think of the term sympathy as kind of having a negative meaning? Whenever you say to someone, well, I sympathize with you. What you mean is I sympathize with you in I feel sorry for you. We basically mean I feel sorry for you in the state in which you are, but there's nothing that either I can or that I shall do about your state. That's the modern use of the term sympathy. The older term meant not only these internal feelings and emotions and that you went along with the sufferings of someone else, but you were there willing to help the person as well. I don't like the term pity and sympathy as they're used just in common English today. We say that's a pity. We mean, something shameful. That's a shame. When we say, I sympathize with you, we mean I don't want to get involved with your case here, but I feel sorry for the state that you're in. Well, just turning to these passages, Hebrews 4 and Hebrews 10, we can prove to ourselves that that was not the meaning of the term then. Whenever Christ can sympathize with us, did he just say, well, I feel sorry for you people down there on earth, but there's really nothing I can or I want to or I shall do for you? Not at all. It was because of his feeling toward us that he did do something about the misery in which we exist. And in chapter 10 of Hebrews in verse 34, notice these people didn't just sympathize with the author of Hebrews in the sense of, well, we feel sorry for you. Ye had sympathy of me in my bonds, but look at this, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods. In other words, they must have sent assistance to whoever this individual is who's writing the book of Hebrews. They didn't just feel sorry for him that he was bound or in prison or house arrest or whatever he means by in my bond, but you took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that you have in heaven a better and an enduring substance. So it goes beyond just the realm of feeling sorry. Therefore, what we're saying is sympathy does not mean to feel sorry for someone else. It does not mean to feel sorry. It means to be a co-sufferer. Now, they may actually be getting the blows on the back. You might not be getting the blows, but you're a co-sufferer internally. You're a co-sufferer internally. For instance, later in this book, the last chapter, as a matter of fact, in the 3rd verse, we don't have the word appearing here, but we have the identical same thought. Hebrews 13:3. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. And that's a good description of what sympathy is about. You exist and live as though you were experiencing what that person is experiencing because you're a co-sufferer with them. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity as yourselves also being in the body, or being yourselves also in the body. So it does not mean to feel sorry for, it means to suffer along with, to suffer with. So here's a little short definition then of what we just said. To suffer sympathy means to suffer with in mind and feeling those who are in distress. To suffer with in mind and feeling those who are in distress, and to have a practical outworking of this as well. See, Jesus did something about his sympathy for us. The Hebrew Christians did something about their sympathy for the author of the book. They did something practical, some demonstrative act that expressed the internal considerations they had. To suffer with, in mind and feeling, those who are in distress, and to have some practical outworking of this. Sympatheo, the verb. Then we have sympathes. S-U-M-P-A-T-H-E-S. S-U-M-P-A-T-H-E-S. An adjective that, of course, would therefore mean sympathetic. That occurs only once in 1 Peter 3:8. I know I can hardly tell you how blessed I've been in looking at these virtues. It's really low-key. It's no great revelation of a new idea or something. It's just basic Christianity is what it is. I know it's affecting me just going over these verses, correcting all of these verses and seeing what the meanings are behind all of these terms. Just basic Christianity, but I guess basically that's what most people are missing, though. They sometimes have the extra trappings, the miracles or something. They have the trappings, but no essence, no meat on the bone, as it were. 1 Peter 3:8. Mistranslated as compassion. We're going to try to be narrow again and keep all of our words, our mercy, pity, sympathy, and compassion words, in their proper categories. So here's really the only sympathy verse that applies to us. Applies to us as a Christian virtue. Hebrews 10:34 could vicariously, but that just speaks of someone else's sympathy they had on the apostle. That's not a commandment for us to have any sympathy. You couldn't base the requirement or the thought that exists as a requirement for you to have sympathy toward others on a narrative account in Hebrews 10:34 of what someone had on the author of the book of Hebrews. But you could base it on 1 Peter 3:8 because it's a commandment. Finally, be all of one mind, be sympathetic, having compassion one of another. The word is sympathes. Be sympathetic. Now that just about deals with this verse. You should have that hacked up so it looks like a patchwork quilt now. Finally, be all of one mind, be sympathetic, love his brethren, be tender-hearted, and be humble. Is what the verse should say. We've changed three things: compassion to sympathy, pity to tender-heartedness, courteousness to humility. Be all of one mind, sympathetic, love his brethren, tender-hearted, and humble. So that doesn't appear to be a very important word, and we're going to make a little distinction between the others in just what I said, but essentially you can see that we're all talking about the same thing. Mercy is seeing someone in need and distress, the emotions that you have there. Pity is the same, plus an "oh" exclamation point. Sympathy is the same, but you kind of suffer along with them. You see, they're all very closely related. That's why sometimes You'll find in the English versions, as we'll see with compassion in the NIV, they go back and forth. Compassion, pity, sympathy, mercy, kind of back and forth because we're talking about things that are very similar. We only find it in one time, really, in the sense of being applied to a Christian virtue, and that's 1 Peter 3:8. He gives us this little succinct summary here of some virtues of unity, of sympathy, of love, of tenderheartedness, and of humility. And then that leaves us with compassion, and we'll be through with these terms. We'll spend most of the rest of our time here on compassion because it's a much larger word, more important in as much as it appears more often. Let's get some of this erased. And you'll see that we're going to have a word that was really the origin or the basis for our words when we looked at tender-hearted or tender-heartedness. Plagchnon. Splunknon. Splunknon. Splagchnon. Splunknon. This is probably the term you'll find most interesting, more interesting than the other three, just in its origin and how it's used and how it's come out. Splunknon. Now you might not remember, but we had given you Eusplanknos is essentially the word that we've translated tender-hearted. Eusplanknos is a word, by the way, found here in 1 Peter 3:8 that KJV gave us as pitiful that needs to be tender-hearted. It was Eusplanknos. You can tell that we're talking about the same word. We just have a prefix here. Splanknos, splanknon, essentially the same thing. It's a noun that appears 11 times. A noun that appears 11 times. And by the way, in the New Testament, it's always found in the plural in the New Testament. Which would what? Reply to that. An A ending instead of an O ending. It always appears as splunknot. I just gave you the singular form. This is the plural form. It's always found in the plural in the New Testament. Literally, it means one's entrails or inner parts is literally what the word means. Heart, bladder, kidney, and particularly, and probably chiefly, intestines, the large and small intestines. This is the word from which we get our word. Spleen comes from this Greek term. Splunknon. You can see spleen in that. We get our term spleen. Occurs 11 times. Only once is it used literally in the New Testament. All the other times are figurative uses, and that's generally the way that the word will appear. It's always in the plural, and it generally will appear in a figurative sense for one's heart, and what we mean by heart or one's intestines, we mean those inner parts, inner emotions, inner affections, inner love, compassion, inner sympathy, whatever, however people want to translate it. Now we're going to look at all the passages. The King James translators generally gave us that term, bowels, which was fine for then, but it's not fine for today. Bowels today means something different than what they meant then. But that is generally what you'll find in the King James. You ever wondered about that term? It talks about bowels of mercy. You wonder, what's he talking about there, bowels of mercy? Well, we'll show you whenever we get to some of these passages then. What it means is basically the small and the large intestines. It means one's inner parts, but the emphasis generally seems to be on intestines. That seems to be... Why? Because, heart, there are other terms for heart, so we can put that in another category. And what's the chief thing that you have inside of you when you see someone cut open, if you've ever seen someone cut open or something? It's this accordion that comes out, looks like a jump rope that'll stretch 20 yards or something. It's the intestines in the individual. They're more noticeable than the liver or the kidney or something like that, if you know what intestines look like. And you can look at an animal and you find the same thing and just rip this whole cord out of there. And so it's more prominent in the inner part of the person. Therefore, probably this is the term we're to think of. It only appears once literally, and that's in Acts 1:18. Acts 1:18 is the only time where it appears in a literal fashion. And, of course, KJV, as its custom is, will generally give us bowels. Just maybe always. I think there might be one time that it doesn't, but almost always it's bowels. And bowels for us is defecation. It's not intestines or something. So we really have to change this because of the way we use the terms now. Now this man purchased a field with the reward of iniquity, Judas Iscariot. And falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and all of his bowels gushed out. Well, that's pretty grotesque. It's grotesque enough to read that his intestines split out of him. But I guess it's not as bad as having his bowels come out of him. So that needs to be intestines there. You could say inner parts, but again, you don't generally think of the bladder or the lung or the kidney. You think of that rope that comes out of the person. How many of you know what I'm talking about? I want to make sure I know. You've practiced an autopsy before. Okay. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, it is a long thing. I wish I would have checked my statistic to find out exactly how long the intestines are. How long? 24 feet. I mean, that'll stretch a long way across someone's living room. 24 feet. And that's all wrapped up on the inside of you. I knew it was a long thing. I think my guess was a little too far, 20 yards long, but it's pretty long. There's no doubt about that. So that's what you think of on the inner parts. If you slit the stomach open, what comes out, it's not the heart. That's protected up in the chest cavity anyway. It's all the intestines. Splunkna, the intestines. This is the only time that it appears literally, Acts 1:18, and NIV gives intestines, and that should be given. Intestines are inner parts, or entrails, but that's not a well-known term, I don't suppose. Intestines is better known. And on one occasion, it's going to speak of the bowels of Jesus Christ, the splunkna of Jesus Christ. And King James gives that to us as bowels. And so, of course, whenever it has reference to Jesus, it's the same thing as when it has reference to us. But using a term like bowels, which I think is over in Philippians, we'll find it when we go through these other 10 times here of splunknon or splunkna, it's really inappropriate to speak of the bowels of Jesus Christ with the way that we use bowels today. Now, if you want to say, well, the intestines of Jesus Christ, that would be rather inappropriate as well. So we're going to have to opt for another translation in passages like that. But remember, we're only talking about what it literally means, the intestines. And it generally is going to be used in the figurative sense in the New Testament. Okay, let's begin with Luke 1:78. Luke 1:78. We'll go through these references. Then we'll have the verb that appears 12 times. Splunknitsomai. We'll look at that in a moment. We're just looking at splunknon, or the plural splunkna. Luke 1:78. And by the way, we're under compassion terms right now. We have these two terms, these splunknon, splunknitsomai terms, which are compassion terms. To give knowledge of salvation unto his people by the remission of their sins through the tender mercy of our God. And notice the margin. They gave us bowels of mercy. Almost always in the text they give us bowels. Here's the only time that I can think of where they give us something different, in the text and give us bowels over in the margin. Well, bowels certainly has to be stricken out. Mercy has to be stricken out. This is not a mercy term. It's not a pity term. It's not a sympathy term. It's a compassion term. But probably something like, well, you could use compassion here. That would fit. Through the compassion of our God. Or you could say something like through the affection, or the tender affection, or the deep affection, or the inner affection of our God, whereby the day spring from on high hath visited us, to give us light, to give light to them that sit in darkness and the shadow of death, and guide our feet into the way of peace. So we have to strike that out as not really being appropriate as either bowels or bowels connected with mercy. The word tender is okay because we kind of think of something soft and easy. But deep or inner would be even a better term if you're going to try to describe what type of affection or compassion we're talking about, which is not necessary. You could just leave it that way. So something like through the deep affection or the tender affection of our God. Okay, 2 Corinthians 6:12. That verse, of course, is not an important one for Christian virtues or Christian ethics. Neither is this one in 2 Corinthians 6. It does speak of now not God's compassion or affection, but a Christian for another Christian. But it's not a commandment, though. It's just Paul wishing this were true from the Corinthians to him. 2 Corinthians 6:11-13. O ye Corinthians, our mouth is open unto you, and our heart is enlarged. Ye are not straitened in us, but ye are straitened in your own bowels. Now, if you just kind of read that, it seems like they need to eat some prunes or something, you know. You're not straitened in us, but you're straitened, and it's S-T-R-A-I-T, not G-H-T, but ye are straitened in your own bowels. So you can end up with just really off-the-wall type of meanings with translations like this. Now for a recompense in the same, I speak as unto my children, be ye also enlarged. He said in verse 11, we are enlarged toward you. See the end of verse 11 and verse 13, he says, you ought to be enlarged toward us. So what he's saying there in verse 12 is you need to reciprocate. You know, we have had such deep affections for you, and you should have these same affections for us. So I translate the word affection there. A little different meaning maybe than compassion. Affection. You're not straitened in us, and we could rearrange some of that straightened business and straighten that out a little bit. But we'll skip that since we're not dealing with that. We're just dealing with that word bowels. You're not straightened in us, but you are straightened in your own affections. What he's asking for, it's a little awkward. What's the NIV have, someone? Okay, what's the whole sentence read?
We are not withholding our affections from you, but you are withholding yours from us.
Okay, that's what I tried to say. That's a good way to translate that. We are not holding our affections from you, which he just said in verse 11. Our heart's enlarged toward you. And he says, but you were withholding your affections from us. And that's why in verse 13 he goes on and says, be ye also enlarged, like we are enlarged. So that's probably definitely a good translation of the whole sentence. King James is just awkward and very terrible. You're not straitened in us, but you're straitened in your own affections. Then chapter 7 and verse 15. Oh, I was wrong on my statistics. Here they give us bowels in the margin again. I couldn't remember where it's in the margin. So for one time they gave us a correct translation here. 2 Corinthians 7:15. Speaking of Titus, he's commending him and his love to the Corinthians, to them, and his inward affection. And that's even a good translation because it's affection that's inward. It's in the inner parts. His inward affection, but notice the marginal reference, bowels there. You need to strike the marginal one out and leave the text. His inward affection is more abundant toward you, whilst he remembereth the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling ye received him. I rejoice therefore that I have confidence in you in all things. Now, if you're wondering, one thing that we can't get into, if you're wondering, well, what gave rise to the method of speaking where one's inner parts, intestines, the spleen, the heart, the liver, what gave rise to that being spoken of as, something that's metaphorical? That's a metaphorical use of the term. Well, that's an interesting study. There's a whole interesting history when you get, of course, the New is based on the Old Testament. When you get back into the Old, and you find the same things, bowels back there, and hearts back there, and mind back there. It's a whole system of Hebrew psychology on why they thought the way that they did about the stomach and the innermost being, and Jesus speaks from your innermost belly. Remember over in John 7, shall flow rivers of living water. Well, what does he mean by your innermost belly? And what do we mean here by splachnon or splachna? What's the origin? Why did someone ever use the intestines to speak of feelings like that? Well, that's really a study in psychology in itself, in Hebrew psychology. And Paul and the others doing the writings here, for the most part, are Hebrews, and so, they're accustomed. And just the ancient world itself was accustomed. And to some degree, we're accustomed. We don't too much think of intestines anymore. We talk about our heart going out to someone. Well, your heart doesn't go anywhere. If it does, you'll die. It's inside your body. Your heart going out, or something about the mind, or something about other bodily parts. We use those in a metaphorical or in a figurative sense to have reference to something else. So don't think it's something strange that we're talking about intestines here, because we do the same thing in our culture. Just not with something as pronounced as that. When we talk about inner affection for someone, what do you mean inner affection? That you love them with your liver? Is that what you mean, that your liver actually does the loving? Or that your heart does the loving? Well, your heart does, and it does the pumping is what it does. What does? Well, you see, they had to locate certain parts on the man's body in order to talk about these things, because there's so much confusion and so much mysticism, and I don't mean an incorrect mysticism, but just a difficulty of comprehension over personality. What is personality? What makes up personality? Well, liver, intestines, heart, feet, hands. You can speak with your hands, and your feet say certain things, and the Lord's right arm of salvation, and his ear is not heavy so that he does not hear. All these bodily parts here to try to come to some grips with this difficult subject of human personality. So that's just explaining briefly to you the origin of this. They're trying to come to grips with expressions of what human personality is all about. What are the components of personality, and how do you express personality? And, sometimes whenever you experience fear, it's right in your stomach. What happens, you get knots, we say, in your stomach. Well, there's probably not any really knots down there, but it sure feels like that. Feelings, your personality, and it's affecting you bodily and physically. And where does it affect you? Right in your stomach. And maybe sometimes whenever you're happy, it affects you right there in your stomach. So ancient people thought, that's it. That's where feelings are. They're in their liver, the kidney, the bladder, the intestine. They're somewhere down there. Well, not really. Evidently not really. But yet I can hardly say not really totally, because why is there such a relationship then?
For the continuation of this message.
Not really. Evidently not really. But yet I can hardly say not really totally, because why is there such a relationship then? Why doesn't, your foot hurt whenever you get a sudden fear or something? Someone scares you and it's your stomach. And you know what it feels like whenever you go over a hump in a car too fast. What happens, we say, I lost my stomach. Well, you didn't really lose it. You might lose what was in it in the floorboard, but you don't lose your stomach. But it feels like your stomach's gone. The bottom just dropped out from underneath you. Whenever you start falling real fast like that, you feel something there. Really mysterious. Is there some connection with human personality then? While I'm on that subject, this is an interesting topic. I've already told you about psychology before. Psalm 139. That's why I've studied some of this, because it's just fascinating what the Hebrews thought and what we can glean about human personality from what some people might say are crude descriptions, antiquated references to what we now know in this post-Freudian society in which we live, of what personality and human nature is all about. How about verse 15? My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Well, we need to start with the end of verse 13. And what he's talking about here is pregnancy. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. He's talking about pregnancy here. And then he writes, I will praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought. And that makes us pretty curious about that verse. In the lowest parts of the earth. That mean in hell, that you were made in hell? Or maybe he's teaching evolution here. Man evolved from lower forms of animal life in the earth. That's been suggested. He's teaching evolution. And I guess we could say from verse 14, you'd be fearfully made, okay, if you came by way of the zoo. The chimpanzees, you know. That's fearful. I don't know if that's wonderful or not, though. And I don't know if that's marvelous. Marvelous are thy works, the psalmist said. My soul knoweth that right well. Too many people don't know well or right well at all. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. Well, how can they be fashioned when there's none of them? So that's an interesting passage, a very mysterious passage, a very curious passage there. Goes back to this whole business of, more off the subject of psychology there, but back to this whole business of our bodily parts. Okay, I don't know how we got off on all that, but we need to get back on the subject, back over to the New Testament. We were concluding looking at 2 Corinthians 7:15, his inward affection, which is a good translation. Now we jump over to the book of Philippians. Philippians 1:8, I believe this is the place where we'll have reference to the bowels of Christ, that therefore should be changed. God's my record, how greatly I long after you all in the, or with the, in the affection of Jesus Christ, or in the affections. If you're going to, remember the word's going to always be plural, like pity. Remember, pity's always plural, but once in Colossians 3:12. That's the one time KJV gave it to us, singular, I believe. If you're going to singularize it, that's okay, but you'll take it as a collective term then. I generally have it singularized here. How greatly I long after you all, y'all, in the affection. Well, he doesn't say you guys, does he? In the affection. Well, we're going to get some good southern flavor here in the next couple of days. We'll come back saying y'all. My wife already does. But she's from further south than I am. Oh, no, a 6-hour drive further south of us. Well, you might not notice, but I don't ever say y'all. I always say you guys. I've accustomed myself to you guys. That's the way the northerners, you guys. So Paul was from southern Palestine, we always say. How greatly I long after, we'll just leave it you then, you. In the, but it's you plural though. You in the affection, would be a better translation, in the affection of Jesus Christ. That means the same affection. We're back to this, what are we talking about? The affection Christ has for us, or ours toward Him, like the love of God. Is that our love toward God or God's love toward us? Well, he's obviously talking about his affection expressed toward the Philippians, but he's saying it's the same type of affection as the affection that Christ expresses toward us. Chapter 2 and verse 1. Another little section on virtues. If there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies, popular verse. How about if any affection and pity? We have our affection and pity term, not a mercy term. Both should be plural, but you can keep them in the singular if you mean that collectively. NIV has tenderness and compassion. Well, again, we better change those because it would have been okay to give the first word as compassion, bowels as compassion, because we're under our compassion terms, but not mercies, because it's not a compassion term. Neither is it a mercy term. It's a pity term there. Tenderness for bowels, well, that's possible because I just gave you, here's tender-hearted, eusplanchnos, and here's compassion, splanknon. So we're talking about the same group of words here, but I keep the tender-hearted words in a different category and just translate these as affection, which probably the NIV gave affection over in chapter 1 and verse 8. They gave affection there. So see, then they change it. It's the exact same word in 2:1. Then they change it to tenderness. So we should have, if any, affection and pity. Now, of course, he's talking about affection and pity from the Christians, from one Christian to another. Then we're going to find some references where something like heart might be the best translation, because it does just mean inner parts, generally intestines, but you'll see what I mean. Intestines don't fit well in some of these places. The word is very popular in the little book of Philemon. It's found 3 times, 11 times in the New Testament, and a quarter of those are found right in the little book of Philemon. Verses 7, 12, and 20. Verses 7, 12, and 20. For we have great joy and consolation in thy love, because the bowels of the saints are refreshed by thee, brother. Because the intestines of the saints are refreshed by you. How about the bladder of the saints? Kidney? No, none of those seem to fit real well. What about because the affections of the saints are refreshed by thee? Well, that doesn't fit very well either. So hearts would probably be the best translation. But we're talking about the internal feelings, though. But hearts would just be used as a figure of speech. Because the hearts of the saints are refreshed by thee, brother. Verse 12. Whom I've sent again, thou therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels. That is mine own heart. And verse 20. Yea, brother, let me have joy of thee in the Lord. Refresh my heart in the Lord. And I think the NIV probably gives that as heart. Then in 1 John, chapter 3 and verse 17, another time where splunkna appears, and probably best translated as something like heart here as well. Now the King James gave us bowels, and then in italics of compassion, which really would just be repeating itself because they're essentially the same term. Bowels and compassion, the way the King James is using them. The way the King James, for instance, over in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, translates a word, translates another word here, a verb, as compassion or to have compassion, is the same as the term bowel here. NIV, I think, gives pity here. But it's not a pity term, though, so it can't be pity. But whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his heart from him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? Of course, what he means is shutteth up his pity, shutteth up his mercy, shutteth up his sympathy. And he can mean any of those things, but we're going to have to stay with whatever word group that we're using here. Shutteth up his heart Okay, now that's going to tell us something about these splunk words right away, that they're not just an internal feeling, they're definitely an internal emotion. And they are expressed as being something that's internal more, to a larger degree, than the other words. The other words aren't so definitely connected with the internal aspects of man, because this means intestines here. But it doesn't mean just something like internal feelings or emotions that you can feel and not do anything about it, because here he said, you shutteth up your heart. This man shuts up his heart from him. He says, how dwells the love of God in you? When you see that your brother has need. You have this world's good, and you see that your brother has need. In other words, there's always the internal feeling that works itself out in a practical application of that. You can't just say, well, I sympathize with you, I feel sorry, and not help the person. You can't just say, well, I'm compassionate. Compassionate is an internal feeling. I'm compassionate, but you're really not if you don't do something, if you have the ability to help the individual. Then you can't say, I have compassion on them. This is the compassion word. We translate it hard, and it means essentially the same. And then I guess that leaves us with, one more in Colossians? Colossians 3. We've dealt with this passage a lot now. We left it last time. We found, I believe, a pity term there. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12. But we kind of left it alone until I said we could come to the sympathy and compassion terms. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies. Now remember, over in Philippians 2:1, they gave us bowels and mercies. Over in Philippians 2:1 in the KJV. And really we need, of course, affections and pity there. Okay, the term splunkna is the term behind bowels. That's obvious. It's a term behind bowels. The term behind mercies is the pity term, the only time in the New Testament where it's found in its singular form. So we can't translate it bowels, neither can we translate it mercies. It has to have pity, and it has to have something that says heart or affection or intestines or compassion. So something like a heart of pity. A heart of pity. NIV gives compassion, which is okay, but I don't think they give us our pity term, though. They just give us compassion, which would be okay. That would be the word behind bowels. Well, then they don't give us any term, I don't think, behind mercies. And we need a pity term. So it would read like this. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, a heart of pity, then kindness, then humility, then meekness. And that must be one of the places they give gentleness in. See, that's wrong. That's a gentle term, not a meek term. And then long-suffering. So we've dealt with everything in this verse, I guess, except the long-suffering there. Just about completed that little section. Okay, basically that's all we'd have to say about the splunknon noun that appears 11 times. Then we have another term. That's a verb that appears 12 times. That is splunknitsomai. Which is just similar to our other term here. Which is a long term, Splagchzomai. Splagchzomai. Splagchzomai is the verb which appears 12 times. It only appears in the Gospels and only in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Again, it's really the same as a noun, to have one's inner parts moved over the state of others. To yearn with compassion. I believe that it's only used of Jesus. the verb. It's interesting because the noun is used of God, but it's used of Christians as well. The verb is only used of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The KJV, it's generally moved with compassion. Which is perfectly acceptable translation. Let's just look at a few of the passages. I guess I can list all of them. Well, I'll list a few. I'll tell you which ones we want to look at because the NIV will be the one that has some problems here. Matthew 9:36, he was moved with compassion when he looked out over the people. Matthew 14:14, Matthew 15:32, and then we'll look at Matthew 18:27. It's found more in Matthew than any other place. We'll look at Matthew 18:27, particularly if you have the NIV with you. We've already looked at this passage in the 33rd verse. Shouldest not thou also have had, and King James gives us compassion the first time and pity the next time in verse 33, and both of those are mercy terms there. Well, now we're back earlier in 27. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion. That's generally how it's translated in the King James, moved with compassion. And the NIV has pity here, and loosed him and forgave him the debt. But it's not a pity term, it's a compassion one. Hope you're not getting tired of me. I'm almost getting tired of myself saying, it's not a such and such term, it is a such and such term. But we had to do that to change all of these things. One day soon we'll be through with all of these virtues here. Chapter 20 and verse 34 is another place that's found in Matthew. Mark 1:41, 6:34, 8:2, and we'll need Mark 9:22. Case of the man with his boy who needs deliverance. Oftentimes it casts him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So it should not be pity, it should be compassion. Then we've got several times in Luke. Less in Luke, most in Matthew, but the larger number of passages in Luke need to be changed from the NIV. Luke 7:13. I don't think Luke 7:13 is wrong, but it's just breaking the continuity of the compassion passages. I think it expresses it very well here, and I think I gave it as one way we could translate this, that someone's heart went out. We don't really mean that your heart went out, but it's a way of expressing your internal emotions and connection to the people or to the individual. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. Isn't that what the NIV has there? Well, that's fine. That's a beautiful translation. So I guess you can leave that if you want to, but you may want to note that it's a compassion term behind his heart went out toward her. It's a compassion term. Splanchnizomai. That's a beautiful way to translate it, but if we're going to do it that way, let's do it the same in all the passages in the Gospels then. That whenever Jesus looked out over the multitude, his heart went out to them, as sheep having no shepherd. That's a beautiful translation. It's totally fine and totally reliable. But it's inconsistent. When you say compassion sometimes, pity sometimes, and then heart went out in this occasion. Chapter 10 and verse 33. A certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. When he saw him, he had pity. No, it should be he had compassion on him. Luke 10:33 should read compassion and not pity. And then the final time is in chapter 15. Chapter 15 and verse 20. It's always used of Jesus. or in his, in his teachings, in his life and ministry. Even if someone else is asking, using the term, someone else could use the term compassion, like the man in Mark 9, but he said, Lord, have compassion on us, so it's still God's compassion. Here, of course, we have an allegory or a parable told here, and the compassion really would be the compassion of the Heavenly Father, not just the earthly Father. He arose and came to his father, the prodigal son, the first of two prodigal sons, really, in this story. The elder brother was more of a prodigal than the prodigal. But when he was yet, if you don't know what prodigal means, you have to look up in a dictionary, I guess, then. But everybody knows this as the prodigal son story. But the elder brother was really the more prodigal of the two. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. So, we've got then about 23 times for compassion terms as splunk na and splunk nitsomai. It means to have a deep internal feeling and affection for others. Especially those in need, and to the point of helping them with their need. To have a deep internal affection or feeling or longing or attachment for others or to others. Especially to those who are in need. And I guess we could say we're all in need. We're all in need of others' love and others' encouragement and others' affection. So we're all in need. We've looked then at mercy, pity, sympathy, compassion. The few moments we have left, let's kind of sum these four terms up. We'll be through with this little category then. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mercy, pity, sympathy, compassion. Mercy. You see how similar these are here. Mercy would be something like your emotional response to the sight of a person suffering under a load of misfortune, misery, or injustice. Your emotional response to the sight of a person suffering under a load of misfortune, misery, or injustice. And then, of course, you act out in practical outworkings your emotional response. The opposite of being cold again, the opposite of being cold-hearted. Tender-heartedness, we said, was opposed to callousness. Mercy, as well as these others, opposed to being coldly indifferent to other people's misery. Pity means mercy with an O, O-H, exclamation. Maybe, if anything, a little deeper feeling of mercy. Sympathy means to be a co-sufferer with someone else in their affliction. You remember how Paul says over in Romans 12, laugh with those that laugh, rejoice with those that rejoice, and weep with those that weep. There'd be a good description of sympathy there. Be a co-sufferer. And you know, it's like rubbing a cat hairs backward. Whenever you laugh, whenever someone else is crying, the best thing to do is sympathize. Be a sufferer along with them. So it means to be a co-sufferer, to suffer with someone. Not bodily necessarily, that's chiefly not the meaning, but internally, in your mind and your feelings. And compassion is chiefly, we're going to try to get this word internal in. Although all of these others are internal as well, that's the origin for the word. It's to have a deep internal affection. A deep internal affection or concern for others. So that it feels like your bowels, your intestines are spilling out. You're wanting to reach and help and bless and encourage and minister to and strengthen and lift up and hold up the other individual. That's opposed, you see, to beating people down. All of these words are just opposed to that. So it's a very strong term, compassion. All of these are strong terms. All of these are profoundly emotional terms here. A person who lacks emotions obviously could never really express mercy or pity or sympathy or compassion. And if you're like that, you really wouldn't know what I'm talking about in teaching on this subject until you somehow strike the root of your emotions and get them burning again and stirred up again to know what it's like to manifest these things, these qualities, these virtues, because they're all intensely emotional. And then some scriptures along with each of these, just summing it up. Mercy would be Romans 12:8. Gift of showing mercy, do it with cheerfulness. These are mercy passages. James 2:13. You'll have judgment without mercy if you don't show mercy. Matthew 5:7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And Jude 22 and 23. Show mercy toward those. Pull them out of the fire, hating even the garments spotted by the flesh. Pity. Philippians 2:1. These are the verses specifically that would apply to the Christian virtue of these things. Not just God's mercy or God's pity or someone's pity or mercy or sympathy or compassion in a narrative account, but ours to one another. Philippians 2:1, Colossians 3:12, Luke 6:36. Be pitiful even as your Father who is in heaven is pitiful. Sympathy. We only have one verse for sympathy. That's 1 Peter 3:8. The adjective sympathes. Peter said, be sympathetic toward one another. Suffer along with someone else. And then finally, compassion. We've got several terms. 1 John 3:17. Chiefly, we have Philippians 2:1 and Colossians 3:12. Same two passages with pity. Philippians 2:1, Colossians 3:12. They have compassion terms and pity terms there. So what we mean by compassion in the sense of a verse like Philippians 2:1 would be deep affection. That's the meaning. If you want to put the word deep in there, you can. If it's internal, it is inside. It's deep inside. But Philippians 2:1, if there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any deep affection and pity, that is one toward another. Fulfill ye my joy that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind.